Hello and welcome to the West Cork History Festival podcast. I'm Victoria Kingston, a co-founder of the festival, and to find out more about the festival and hear more podcasts, please visit our website, westcorkhistoryfestival.org. You're about to hear the writer and journalist Anna Reid, recorded at our 2024 festival, speaking about her book, A Nasty Little War, The West's Fight to Reverse the Russian Revolution. Anna has written and researched widely on Russian and Ukrainian history and is the author of 4 books looking at the history of those countries. I hope you enjoy the talk. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for joining us for this talk in the Octagon. I'm delighted to introduce Anna Reid, who is a writer and a journalist and a historian who has for many years written about Russian and Ukrainian history. She was the Economist's correspondent in Kyiv, and she is a trustee of the Ukrainian Institute in London, who are currently doing incredible work raising the profile of Ukrainian history and culture and politics. And she's written 4 books about Russian and Ukrainian history. We've asked her today to speak about her book, A Nasty Little War, which she has in her hand, which is available in the bookshop. The West's Fight to Reverse the Russian Revolution, which is a really extraordinary piece of work, ranging across a huge geographical area, many different involvements by different Allied troops in Russia post-revolution. But she's also knows a lot about Ukrainian history. So perhaps in the questions we could draw that out a bit in terms of the current situation in Ukraine. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you for having me on. I'm here to talk about something called the intervention, which was an attempt by the Allies, chiefly by Britain, France, America, and Japan, to reverse the Russian Revolution by coming in on the side of the many anti-Bolshevik armies, governments that declared themselves round the periphery of the collapsed Tsarist Russian Empire after the Bolsheviks launched their successful coup at the end of 1917 in Petrograd. And I thought I'd open with a quote from an interventionist, a couple of quotes actually from an interventionist. He's being interviewed in old age, but he's writing about what he's talking about is his time as a 19-year-old pilot on the Caspian. And when his mission is wound up, they're treated to a banquet by by their local supporters, what he calls local potentates. And he describes it. He says, it's the usual sort of alcoholic assault course, which these events, still are in Russia, as anyone who's done business there will know. He writes, I made a jolly long speech while I still could, telling them what jolly good chaps they were. When the party broke up at 2 a.m., the 4 Englishmen were all still on their feet. Such Russians who hadn't gone off with the waitresses were under the table, so we thought we'd kept the Union Jack flying fairly well. This kind of jocular anecdote is very typical for interventionists' interviews and memoirs. But then his interviewer asks him, so what, in retrospect, do you think of the intervention as a whole? And he becomes much more serious. And he replies, it was a political nonsense, a waste of time, money, and everything else. I suppose it kept a few of us from cluttering up the unemployment bureaus at home, but that's about all. It was an uncomfortable business, a really nasty, dirty little war. And that's the phrase I borrowed for my book. So what was this war? What was the intervention? It started while the First World War with Germany was still underway in the spring of 1918, with small landings up at Murmansk, which is up here, up above Petrograd. Oh, that's not working. Hang on. bother. Anyway, I'm going to point up here, don't worry, Murmansk and Vladivostok, right down here on the Pacific. Just a few small parties of Marines were initially landed, specifically with a very specific, limited goal of guarding warehouses full of military equipment, which America and Britain and France had been supplying to the old Tsarist army, our ally in the war against Germany. Now, at this stage, in early 19, the Bolshevik, this new ultra-radical, crazy, very unexpected, incomprehensible new government in Moscow is in talks with the Germans. And we, of course, are frightened that they will hand all these great warehouses full of military supplies to Germany and make the war on the Western Front even harder. And it, as interventions tend to do, it then expanded. So it ends up with large multinational expeditionary forces being sent to 5 different theatres. So the Far East and Siberia, the Caspian, the southern Russia and Ukraine, the Baltics, and then the war in the north is expanded down the rivers and the railways towards Petrograd, Petersburg as it is again now. And it's quite a big effort. It involves about 180,000 troops from 16 different countries. And the largest contingents were Japanese, but they restricted themselves to east of Lake Baikal, to eastern Siberia and the Pacific. They weren't really interested in who was in power in Moscow. They wanted to tighten their grip on Manchuria. And for complicated reasons I might have time to get to, it also involved large numbers of Czechs, ex-prisoners of war, who ended up taking control of the whole Trans-Siberian all the way to the Pacific. But politically speaking, it was led by Britain and France. America got dragged in rather reluctantly. And obviously, as we all know, it was an utter, complete failure. Trotsky and Lenin consolidated their hold on power, and one by one, the white armies, that's the anti-Bolshevik armies, white is a sort of catch-all term for all these anti-Bolshevik governments that declared themselves around the edges of the old empire. The white armies were routed by Trotsky's new Red Army, and the Allies fled along with them back onto their troop ships and waved goodbye amid sort of horrible scenes of sort of burning warehouses and frantic civilian refugees being sort of pushed back from the gangplanks. And I was, as I was working on this book, it was reading these sort of scenes from places like Novorossiysk and Odessa, where these very chaotic evacuations happened. The Americans were pulling out of Kabul, and the scenes there were terribly reminiscent. It was exactly the same sort of atmosphere. And it was all over in June 1920, when the last British units, and we were down by that stage to a sort of few machine gunnery trainers and radio operatives, left Crimea, where the last white general standing, a very violent man called Wrangel, was making his sort of last-ditch stand. And so by then, Lloyd George's government was actually in talks with a Soviet delegation to London, largely with the aim of bringing down the price of wheat by allowing Russian imports of wheat again. So you get this odd overlap in the middle of 1920 when British forces are actually still supporting the anti-Bolshevik, the white armies in Russia, but Lloyd George and the cabinet are busy sort of shaking their hands and having drinks with them in London at the same time. So why did I choose this quite short-lived and utterly failed sort of coda to the First World War as a topic? So first of all, it hasn't been written about much before, which is wonderful from the point of view of a historian, because you're not simply refreshing other people's work. There's a bit about it in general histories of the Civil War, and there are sort of technical military histories of the separate campaigns, but there was no one history of the intervention itself. Why was that? Why had it been so little written about it? Largely because it was such a failure. So Soviet propaganda, as you can imagine, made much of it. And Soviet historians wrote about how this Western involvement on the anti-Bolshevik side proved that the White armies in the Civil War were just, Western capitalist puppets. They didn't really represent the people. And also, it fed into the Russian narrative about being surrounded by aggressive capitalist states. But on the Western side, in contrast, there was lots of willed forgetting. So no official history was written, no campaign medals were issued, and in their memoirs, the politicians and senior military involved did their best to distance themselves. They glossed over it, wrote about it as little as possible, or they distanced themselves or blame shifted. And this sort of willed forgetting continued right through the century. So Nixon, at one point, he made an address to the Soviet people on Russian state television. There was a diplomatic initiative going on. And in it, he said solemnly, our two great peoples have never been at war. Completely wrong. And Thatcher actually made the same assertion with Gorbachev when she was welcoming him to Chequers during Perestroika, though she had managed to forget not only the intervention but the Crimean War. And this rising young Politburo member, put her politely right. So sort of second, for a Russianist, this episode, it's an important and very interesting sort of episode in this centuries-long love-hate relationship between Russia and the West. And it goes right back to Peter the Great, simultaneously going off to Amsterdam to learn shipbuilding techniques and telling his boyars they must shave off their beards, and sort of going to war with Sweden. It's this sort of, we want to be like you, but we also dislike you. And it's this sort of thing which it's been going on and on and on. And reading white Russian memoirs of Russians who worked alongside the Allies during the intervention, they were usually written from embittered exile. So these white Russian leaders had fled when the Civil War ended, and they lost, off to Paris or New York or wherever, and wrote from there. And their tone was spookily similar to that of Russian state television and Russian sort of official pronouncements today. And the general line was, we shed rivers of blood for you in the war against Germany. But in our hour of need, you betray us. You make these false promises, you betray us. All you do is send us a bit of substandard military equipment and these junior officers, not nearly enough troops. And then when the going gets tough, you run away. And this sort of injured, sort of self-deluding, injured, insulted, deeply sort of resentful tone. It's right there in sort of Russian official attitudes and in public attitudes, and one comes across little sort of echoes of it even in Russian friends. Today, it's all about inferiority complex. It's almost a sibling rivalry type thing, very psychological. And so also very familiar from today are white Russian attitudes of the time towards the non-Russian nationalities of the old empire. So when the Bolsheviks take power, the non-Russian nationalities, the largest of them, declare independence and start forming their own armies. And had the White Russians deigned to cooperate with the Poles, the Finns, the Georgians, the Ukrainians, the Balts, and so on, they might well have won the Civil War. They would almost certainly have taken Petersburg in particular, because the Finnish army was ready to talk and by far the largest and most effective military force in the area. And the Allies made repeated efforts to get them to get the White Russians to sort of build an anti-Bolshevik front, to make concessions to the non-Russian nationalities in exchange for a joint effort to capture Moscow and Petersburg. But the Russians were having none of it, absolutely none of it. For them, Russia was, one and indivisible, and these upstart ethnic minority governments were a complete joke. And I collected a lot of sort of wonderfully dismissive quotes from various white Russian leaders. So one saying, for example, Finland sort of, laying down conditions, for help, for helping us. That you'd have thought that Finland had conquered mighty Russia. The idea that the little Finns could actually, this tiny little, new country could negotiate, on a sort of equal basis with Russia was total anathema to them. And the other great one was, how can there be an Estonian government? There's no such thing as an Estonian intelligentsia. And so, for Russians then as now, non-Russians who aspired to self-rule were traitors seduced by the West. And also, empire was this very intrinsic part of their own self-image. So, without its empire, Russia wasn't really Russia. So this scratchiness between the Allies and Russia, Western-Russian relations, it was reflected in the personal relations between the British and American and French officers on the ground and their white Russian counterparts who they were liaising with and working alongside. A minority of the Allied officers, particularly the British and French, not the Americans, were genuinely wedded to the anti-Bolshevik cause. So one major, he in his memoir, he says, and he's an old Etonian, very establishment family, and he says, I went, believing, I went in the spirit of crusade. I felt I was defending my caste as well as my country. He also mentions that his more sophisticated friends think he's quite mad, should be having anything to do with it. But people like him are in a minority, and the regular officers, the career officers, in particular, they generally much resent, if they're sent to Russia willy-nilly before the armistice with Germany, they much resent it. They wanted to be in at the kill, as the phrase was at the time. In the war against Germany, they wanted to be in at the kill in France. And if they then volunteer for Russia after the armistice, after Germany's beaten, it's because they want the extra promotion opportunities. They want to go somewhere where they can have more active service and continue with their careers. And this is particularly true, actually, of people who've been in prisoner of war camps. Quite a lot of them have been taken prisoner by Germany early on in the war and sort of sat out the war, mouldering in prisoner of war camps, and now wanted to catch up with their peers to restart their military careers. So, these groups, the career soldiers, they almost invariably took a dislike, were at the very least exasperated with, and mostly took a strong dislike to their Russian counterparts pretty much straight away. I'll quote one of them. He was an artilleryman teaching gunnery in a West Siberian town, teaching gunnery to the Russians. Our allies, he says, were generous to absurdity at times, laughter-loving frequently, devoted comrades at odd moments, delightful hosts and good talkers. But from a military or business point of view, they were a flop. They could not get things done. They were lazy, untidy, pessimistic, boastful, ignorant, untruthful, and dishonest. They had no patriotism, though they wept over holy Russia. They bragged, but were incompetent and often cowardly. They were cruel. They hated the Allies for not sending enormous armies to settle their troubles, while the only people who could clean up the mess were themselves. So he's unusually sort of comprehensive, but that was the general feeling. So the Russians, however, in their memoirs, gave as good as they got. Broadly speaking, we felt they were sort of drunken, disorganized, and reactionary. And they felt that we were arrogant, ignorant, and condescending. And everybody was right. So here's a quote from a Russian general. He was one of the senior people in the north, so remembering. He says, the English responded to any Russian views with backslapping and that typical English joviality that makes interlocutors wonder if they are dealing with a very clever and cunning person or a complete simpleton. The outcome was always the same. The English always did everything their own way and always met with failure. And on the, sort of the other thing that the Russians thought we were was naive. And on this, they had an extremely good point. And I'll tell in brief this, and the best illustration of that is the story of something called Dyer's Battalion. And this was a unit put together by the Ironside, Edmund Ironside, the leader of this multinational force up in the north. And one of his repeated themes was how his Russian counterparts, because Russian counterparts were building up their own Russian army there as well, needed to look after their soldiers better, take more care of them, be more closely in contact with them, know what they were thinking, train them better, look after their welfare. And he would repeatedly lecture the Russian officers about doing this. And at one of these lectures, a man put up his hand at the end and said, "Do you want us to be valets to our men?" So he was always grumbling about the Russian officers' attitude towards their soldiers. And he thought, and going to visit the town prison, he spotted there were lots of peasant soldiers in there, just being left sort of mouldering, nothing being done with them. And he thought they could easily be retrained and built up into an effective new, he called it an Anglo-Slav battalion. And he put a lot of, so he did this, and he did put a lot of work into it, and he got very emotionally, he sort of became emotionally committed to this project, and was very proud of it, and he sort of put this new unit, he fed them up, trained them, uniformed them and everything. He put them at the head of the sort of parade for the king's birthday, and he would take visiting bigwigs to go and visit them and watch them doing drill and this kind of thing. And his Russian counterparts, like Marashevsky, were sort of sucking their teeth, going, you didn't see the mutinies, like we did last year when our soldiers all turned on us. But Ironside's confident, and when he thinks they're ready, he sends them down to the front, to a quiet bit of the front. A few weeks later, they do indeed mutiny, and they shoot 12 officers in their beds. They stick their rifles through the windows of the hut where they're quartered. There are five British and 7 Russians, and the whole battalion sort of disappears off into the woods. And the leaders are rounded up, and then there's sort of horrible sort of exemplary public executions. And the Russian firing party, deliberately they're given only 1 round per rifle, because the fear is that they will turn their rifles on the British. And several of them fire in the air. And so these 12 mutineers who are sort of tied to posts by the riverbank, by the Dvina, the Brits have to step forward with their revolvers and shoot them in the head. So it's a really nasty episode, and Ironside is completely devastated by it. Basically, and he writes in his diary, I can't bear to think of it. It's so horrible, and it's the worst thing I've been through in the 5 years of the war, which is saying something considering he'd been on the Western Front. And after that, he's a bit like a popped balloon. Everyone, he'd been terrifically sort of can-do and positive and energetic up till then, and afterwards, he simply wants to get out as soon as possible. So another reason for choosing the intervention to write about, it's a fantastically sort of lively, colourful story. It's fought all over the place, from the Arctic down to the sort of Central Asian desert. And I had a fascinating time. It was a wonderful excuse for me to go up to Murmansk and Archangel and to all these towns where the Brits and Americans were headquarters. And I had a fantastic time with these lovely Russian PhD students, sort of bumping about the place in vans, sort of up and down these rivers along dirt roads, and talking to people who sort of collected. You can see all the trenches, the bits they sort of dug themselves, defences, and you can see these bunk houses and grown over trenches are still there, and quite a lot of local people make a hobby of collecting old shell cases, and they show them off to you very proudly. And I also was able to go down to Baku, which is a fascinating city with an extraordinary history. It's an extraordinary sort of architectural history. But it's also sort of full of incident. There are coups, there are assassinations, there are narrow escapes. People there are sled chases across the snowy steppe. There are 40-foot plywood speedboats sort of raiding the red-held naval base at Kronstadt. There are armoured train duels, which are my favourite, where 2 trains, opposing trains, armed with howitzers and big naval guns, would sort of fire at each other, usually from rather a long distance. Up in the north, it's all forested, so you had to watch out for the enemy train's puff of steam then fire at that, then they'd fire back at you. And there were these armoured train chases as well, where the fleeing train, you'd tear up the track behind you and burn all the bridges. And then the pursuing train would repair the track and rebuild the bridges. Sort of with these sort of long-range artillery duels going on all the while. And sort of in their quite plentiful downtime, the officers at least also had quite a deal of fun. So in these provincial towns where they were headquartered, they were feted, as you can imagine, as saviours by the local middle classes. So their diaries are absolute. It's a roll call of sort of concerts and picnics and tea parties and race meetings and opera. And I'll give you one, and it was terrifically flattering. You were always being told how wonderful you were and how grateful they were. And here's a nice quote from, he's a Yorkshire signals sergeant, and he was totally thrilled to be invited to the ballet by his unit's locally hired telephonist, who was a refugee Russian baroness. So he says, when I went into the box, the whole audience stood up and shouted in Russian, "How do you do? Welcome." And all the Russian troops that were in there, they all saluted. I didn't know what to do. I saluted back and knew the Russian for thank you, and they were delighted. It was a marvellous show. But of course, it wasn't all fun. There was a very dark side to it. I intended this book, actually, when I embarked on it, as something of light relief after a very grim book I wrote previously about the siege of Leningrad in the Second World War, which is all about mass starvation. So I intended this as something, actually, of a black comedy, of a sort of short, sharp black comedy. But the blackness quickly came to dominate. So deaths in actual fighting in the Russian Civil War were relatively few because the armies were small and there weren't very many big set-piece battles. But the background civilian suffering was horrendous from sort of exposure and hunger, but also chiefly from a typhus epidemic. Typhus is spread by lice, which flourish in overcrowded, dirty conditions, in towns packed full of refugees. And particularly awful were the two great retreats along the railways at the end of the Civil War. So eastwards from Western Siberia towards Vladivostok, and south from sort of a bit south of Moscow down to Novorossiysk, which is here, which has been in the news because it's now it's the base for the Russian Black Sea Fleet now. And they were both during the winter, and the Red Cross trains and the refugee trains would throw out corpses at every stop, and it was a common sight to see a great stack of corpses at the end of a platform or in a siding, most of them stripped of their clothing. So also, all sides, the Civil War was characterised by horrible atrocities on all sides. So mass arrests, mass executions, extrajudicial killing of political suspects, mass executions of prisoners of war, violent reprisals against suspect villages. And what was very striking was how the British in particular, not the Americans, or the Americans much less so, turned a blind eye to them. So here's a quote. It's from the same major who originally felt that, that he was on Russia, on a crusade, a moral crusade going to Russia. So he and a colleague ride by chance into a town in the south where Don Cossacks have just rounded up about 300 prisoners. And he writes, the prisoners were terrified, pleading that they'd been forcibly conscripted and their families taken hostage. The following morning, they were nonetheless taken out of the town and all shot with machine guns. It was a sickening experience, but as our opinion was never asked, it was wisest to try not to see what happened. So we have similar attitude of blind eye turning to white pogroms. To go back a bit, in March 1918, Germany had come to a peace deal with the Bolsheviks, with Lenin and Trotsky, under which it had been allowed to occupy the whole of Ukraine, which is about 10% Jewish. It's part of the old Tsarist Pale of Settlement. There were restrictions, if you were Jewish, on where you could live. When Germany's defeated at the end of that year, it withdraws again, leaving behind this power vacuum in Ukraine into which a whole bunch of different armies pile. The Red Army, the White Army under a man called Denikin, the Polish army, two rival Ukrainian armies, plus a bunch of warlords. And there's total anarchy through the whole of 1919. Now, Kiev is reckoned to have changed hands about a dozen times. And scapegoated by all sides are Jews. And as these sort of bands of drunken soldiers come and go, there are fearful, repeated scenes of massacre, torture, mass rape, all in public, all in the streets. And the latest scholarship puts the total pogrom deaths in the period somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000. And anyone who wants to follow it up, I recommend Jeffrey Weidlinger's book called In the Midst of Civilized Europe. It's new and excellent. He's at the University of Michigan. So all sides were guilty, but this very much included the whites, for whom it was an article of faith that the Jews had made the revolution, they were behind the revolution, and that Jew equaled Bolshevik. And they explicitly incited violence against Jews in their propaganda. There's a famous poster, one of many similar ones, of Trotsky, depicted bare-chested with the Star of David on his chest and sort of grotesquely large nose and full lips. And he's like as if climbing sort of gorilla-like over the walls of the Kremlin with beneath him a sort of field of skulls. And the protocols of the elders of Zion, sort of a fake bit of anti-Semitic propaganda from the turn of the century. That was reprinted in large numbers. And the old Tsarist slogan, beat the Yids, save Russia, that was revived and pasted up. You could see it, you'd see it if you walked into a newly taken town, the whites had just taken it. There it would be posted up on lampposts and walls. So by the second half of 1919, when the white pogroms were at their peak, the only interventionists left in Ukraine were the British. So the Americans hadn't really got involved in Ukraine. They'd just restricted themselves to a few naval ships in the Black Sea, ferrying refugees and humanitarian aid. And the French had pulled out after total disasters at Odessa and Sebastopol. In Sebastopol, the French sailors mutinied, saying we want to go home, and actually ran up the red flag. But largely thanks to Churchill, who was newly back in the cabinet as Minister of War, the British had actually launched a whole new expedition to the south to support Denikin, and were sending thousands of tons, tanks and guns and trucks and thousands of tons of military equipment to Novorossiysk, and plus the soldiers and officers to guard it and distribute it and train and maintain and so on. And the basic British approach to these hideous white pogroms was not to see them again. And it's extraordinary. They just go totally unmentioned in official communications. Of all the stuff I read, I picked up about sort of 3 cryptic hints as to what was going on. And when Jewish petitioners presented the evidence to the British military mission on the ground, they were fobbed off. What they got was either denials or victim blaming. The usual response was something along the lines of, these reports of excesses was the euphemism of the time. They're untrue or they're exaggerated. Or it would be, yes, regrettable, but the Jews brought this upon themselves because they're war profiteering or because they supported the revolution. And there were similar brush-offs in London. So the Zionist Chaim Weizmann, he asked to be allowed to head a Jewish delegation to go and talk to Denikin and beg Denikin to rein his soldiers in, and he was refused. Churchill vociferously defended Denikin, his protege, throughout. Dodged questions in the House of Commons, and in February of 1920, he wrote a notorious piece in the Sunday Herald blaming international and terrorist Jews for plotting worldwide, for unrest worldwide, everywhere from sort of Cork to Calcutta. And Lloyd George basically let the issue ride. And his strongest note to Churchill of October 1919 was it was attached to a report which Lord Mond had given him, which the Jewish contacts of his in Kiev had passed to him, and then he had passed to Lloyd George, and then Lloyd George then passed it to Churchill with this note. He says, "I wish you would make some inquiries about this treatment of the Jews by your friends. Apart from the iniquity of the proceedings and one's natural repugnance to be involved," well, is it involved or associated? Because that makes a bit difference, doesn't it? And one's natural repugnance to be associated with them. It provides material for a most disagreeable debate in the House of Commons. So in short, for the British government, the pogroms were only important insofar as they caused political problems at home. And at no point did the government threaten Denikin, say to him, unless this stops, we'll withdraw aid. And Cabinet never even discussed this. This was never even brought up as an idea. Oh, I'm running out of time, aren't I? I'll go very quickly through some of the Irish connections to the intervention. So a lot of the top brass were, of course, Anglo-Irish and Ulstermen. So Henry Wilson, head of the army, General Hubert Gough, who headed the Curragh barracks at the time of the so-called Curragh mutiny, and also the head of the British military mission to Siberia, Alfred Knox, another Anglo-Irishman from Ulsterman, I think. And so two of my best officer diarists and memoirists were also Irish. A man called Francis McCulloch, who was a veteran war correspondent who joined up in 1914 and then ended up on with the Knox mission. And he's particularly good. He's got a fantastically sort of sceptical, shrewd, amused eye. I mean, he's really worth reading. And for the career officers, many of them went on, after the intervention was wound up, they went on straight to Ireland, to the Irish War of Independence, which they often talk about in their memoirs even less than they talk about Russia. And it would be interesting to know how influential they were, because there were similarities. It was a rural guerrilla war, mostly, that they were fighting in Russia, and it was, and a lot of the type of warfare is the same. It's about ambushes and raids, and then there are horrible reprisals and village burnings. The tactics they used here, were they partly learned in Russia? It'd be interesting to find out. And the Irish War of Independence, of course, is also one of the reasons the intervention was sort of tapered off fairly promptly. The left and sort of mainstream opinion in Britain had always been pretty lukewarm at best. Anti on the left, lukewarm, the general public, towards the intervention. That people thought, why are we messing around in Russia? Let Russia stew in its own juice. That was the phrase of the time. And with the troubles in Ireland escalating, even the right came round to the view that Ireland just took priority, that the troops, Russia's a luxury. We need the troops for Ireland. I've got 15 minutes left, so I won't sort of try and talk about the aftermath or sort of more about echoes today. And I think I'll throw it, you've heard enough of me, and let's throw it open.